Wyoming Territory, August 1884. The sun was just starting to melt behind the dusty hills outside of Sundance when the laughter started. Sarah Whitlow stood at the edge of the churchyard with her hands clenched around the folded paper in her fingers, a notice she had posted herself, in careful handwriting. It read, "Seeking a decent man for marriage, widow, 2 children, good cook, strong hands, stronger heart." "Who does she think she is?" hissed someone behind her. "She buried one husband and ran off the second. Now she wants another?" Another voice chuckled low. Sarah didn't turn. She kept her eyes on the church bulletin board where her note now hung, fluttering faintly in the warm wind. Her cheeks burned hot with shame, but she held still. She would not be chased off again. She ought to be ashamed, a woman muttered loud enough for everyone to hear. 2 children and still trying to catch a man? Foolish. Then a chair scraped behind her, boots scuffed gravel, and the laughter started to thin out as a tall man stepped forward from the gathered crowd. His voice was quiet but clear. "I would be honored." Heads turned. The man's hat shadowed his face, but he lifted it as he stepped beside Sarah, revealing sharp green eyes and a jaw still dusted with trail dust. He looked straight at Sarah. "My name's Heath McCallister, and I meant what I said." Sarah blinked. Her heart thudded hard in her chest. "You do not even know me. I know you came back here when nobody thought you would. I know you raised 2 children on your own these past 4 years. That tells me enough." The crowd shifted, murmurs dying down. Someone coughed. A few folks wandered off, disappointed the show was over. She looked up at him. "Why would you say something like that in front of everyone?" He shrugged. "Because it is the truth, and because someone needed to." That night, Sarah sat on her front porch with her 2 children, watching the stars blink out one by one. Grace, age 8, leaned against her side. Gideon, 10, whittled a stick on the step beside them. Grace tilted her head. "Mama, who was that cowboy?" Sarah smiled faintly, brushing Grace's hair behind her ear. "His name is Heath. He is kind." Gideon looked up. "He stood up for you." Sarah nodded. "He did." The next day, Heath came by with fresh eggs and 2 carved wooden toys, a horse for Gideon and a bird for Grace. "I figured they might need something to do while we talk," he said, handing them over. Sarah held the door open, hesitant. "You do not owe me anything." "I know," he said simply. They talked on the porch while the children played. He told her he worked cattle over near the Belle Fourche River and had come into town for supplies and horseshoes. "My brother stayed behind in Texas. I went looking for something quieter," he said. Sarah folded her hands in her lap. "You are not like the men around here. Is that a bad thing?" he asked. "No," she said quietly. "It is not." Heath came back the next day, and the next, always with something small, a bundle of kindling, dried apples, a book for the children. He never stayed long, never pushed, just helped fix a broken shutter or carried water from the well. One afternoon, after he had finished mending the fence post behind the barn, Sarah brought him a cup of coffee. She sat beside him on the bench, watching the sky turn orange over the hills. "My first husband died in the winter of '79, she said after a while. "Fell through the ice trying to fish. My second left when Gideon was 6 weeks old. Just packed up one morning and never came back." Heath looked at her, eyes steady. "I am sorry. I was not always this bitter," she said. "But I do not trust easy. Not anymore." "I do not expect you to," he said. She glanced at him. "Then why do you keep coming back?" He seemed to think on that. "Because I want to. Because I like your children. And because you deserve someone who does not scare easy." The wind moved through the grass, soft and low. Sarah looked down at her hands, then back up at the man beside her. "Are you serious about this?" About me? He nodded. I am. Later that week, they walked to town together with the children, and people watched from porches and windows. Sarah held her head high. Heath walked beside her, calm and easy, saying hello to anyone who dared meet his eye. At the general store, the clerk raised his eyebrows. Afternoon, Sarah. Mr. McCallister. Heath tipped his hat. We are buying flour and coffee, and a little extra sugar. For what? Heath smiled at Sarah. For a proper Sunday supper. That night, Sarah cooked roast and bread and blackberry cobbler. Heath sat at the table with Gideon and Grace, listening to their stories, laughing soft when they bickered. After the dishes were done, he and Gideon played a game of checkers while Grace braided Sarah's hair. When Heath stood to leave, he paused at the door. I will not rush you, Sarah, but I need you to know something. She looked at him, heart tight. I meant what I said that day. I would be honored to marry you, and not just for show, but because I am falling in love with you. Her breath caught. I know what folks say. I know you have been hurt, but I am not going anywhere. Not unless you ask me to. Sarah stared at him for a long moment. Then she stepped forward and reached up, brushing a thumb across his cheek. I will not ask you to leave, she whispered. He leaned into her touch. Good. Their hands met in the quiet space between them, fingers twining slowly. Neither of them spoke, but neither needed to. For the first time in a long time, Sarah felt something shift deep in her chest like a door opening, letting in light. She was still afraid, but she was not alone. 3 weeks after the first Sunday supper, Heath laid a hand-stitched saddle blanket across Sarah's porch rail. The weave was tight and dyed in warm earth tones, the corners edged in worn leather. I found it in Fort Laramie last week, he said. Wasn't looking for anything. Just saw it and thought of you. Sarah ran her fingers over the stitching. It's beautiful. Heath leaned his shoulder against the porch post. Thought it might suit that old mare of yours. She's not old, Sarah said, a grin flickering briefly. Just particular. She kicked my boot clean off last time I tried to bridle her. She doesn't like strangers. Heath looked at her then, quiet. Am I still one? Sarah didn't answer at first. The sun hung low behind her, gilding her profile. You're not, she said, voice low. Not to me. Down by the barn, Gideon called out to Grace, and the rattle of a feed bucket echoed up the path. Sarah watched them a moment before turning back toward Heath. They're asking questions now, she said. About what comes next. About you. I'd never make promises to a child I couldn't keep, Heath said. That's not what I'm afraid of. What is? She stepped closer. I've had men come through with fine words and easy smiles. They leave when things turn hard. I don't spook easy, he said. She looked up at him, searching. You said that before. He nodded. And I'll keep saying it until you believe me. That evening, Grace brought out a drawing she'd done in charcoal on scrap paper, 4 figures standing under a cottonwood. That's you, she told Heath, pointing to the tallest shape. Mama's next to you. I gave you a hat. Heath crouched beside her. You got my nose too wide. Grace giggled. It is wide. Heath looked over at Sarah, eyes warm. She's not wrong. After the children were in bed, Sarah brought out a tin of tobacco and a small pipe from a box beneath the counter. She settled on the porch steps beside Heath. My father used to sit right here every evening, smoking and watching the wind blow across that wheatgrass. Heath took the pipe from her, packing it gently. You remind me of someone from home. She tilted her head. Texas. He lit the pipe, passed it back. There was a girl down the road from us years back. She'd taken strays, dogs, calves, even a half-dead crow once. She had this way of fixing things that looked too far gone. Sarah looked into the dark. Did you love her? Heath shook his head. No. But I remember thinking once, if I ever did fall, it'd be for someone who could hold broken things without flinching. Sarah took a slow draw from the pipe, then handed it back. I've been broken a long time. Then you've lasted longer than most. She was quiet a while. Then she said, I've been thinking about what you said. About marrying. Heath didn't move. I'm not ready to say yes, she said. But I'm not saying no. He nodded once. That's enough for me. The moon was high when he finally rose. I'll be back Friday. Gideon said the hens aren't laying right. I'll help mend the coop. Sarah stood with him on the porch. You don't have to do all this. I know. She reached for his hand, fingers brushing his without taking hold. You're a strange man, Heath McCallister. He smiled faintly, only in ways that matter. As he walked down the path, she stayed there, watching until the dark swallowed him. Behind her, Grace stirred in bed, murmuring something in a dream. The wind rustled the wheatgrass, low and steady. Sarah turned back toward the house, her chest full of something she hadn't felt in years, something not quite hope, but close. By mid-September, the cottonwoods along Sand Creek had started to yellow, and the mornings carried a sharpness that hinted at early frost. Sarah rose before first light now, pulling her shawl tighter as she stoked the stove and set water to boil. Heath had begun riding in with the sunrise, his horse tied off at the post while he helped Gideon split wood or checked the barn for fox prints. This morning, he brought a small sack wrapped in oilcloth and handed it to Sarah by the back steps. Found these near the river, he said. Thought Grace might like them. She opened it carefully. Inside were 3 smooth stones, each shaped like a different animal: a turtle, a fish, and a long-legged bird. Their edges were worn by water, their colors soft and speckled. She'll keep them under her pillow, Sarah said. She still thinks dreams can be shaped by what's close. Heath watched her for a moment. And what do you think? Sarah folded the cloth again. I think some things are worth believing, whether or not they're true. He walked with her to the coop. The hens had calmed some since the repairs. Heath's work, mostly, adding new pine slats and patching the gaps with canvas he'd waxed himself. He leaned his arms on the fence and nodded toward the hills. There's a plot of land near Powder River I've been thinking about. Good water, flat enough for corn. Sarah kept her gaze on the hens. You looking to buy? I was. Then I realized I don't want to build something alone. She let the silence stretch, the only sound the hens clucking softly and a distant breeze brushing through the oaks. I'm not sure I know how to build anything with someone anymore, she said. You've already done it, Sarah. He didn't press further. He never did. But she found herself thinking about that land more than she meant to. That Sunday, Pastor Harlan stopped by after service. He stood awkwardly under the porch overhang, hat in hand. Some in town are wondering about your situation, he said, eyes shifting toward Heath, who'd come to sit beside Sarah and was now calmly threading a fishing line for Gideon. I'm not concerned with what they wonder, Sarah answered. I understand. Still, folks are watching. Heath didn't look up. Let them. The pastor shifted again. I only mean it might be less talk if there were clarity. Sarah stood. There's clarity enough in this house. If anyone wants more, they can come ask me direct. Pastor Harlan flushed and nodded. Of course. I'll tell the ladies at the sewing circle to hold their tongues. He left quickly, boots crunching across the packed ground. Sarah exhaled slowly, then turned to Heath. You didn't need to say anything. I didn't like how he said it. She picked up a basket of laundry and handed him a damp sheet. You planning to stay for supper? He took the sheet without a word and helped her clip it to the line. The wind caught it, and it flapped high between them like a flag. That night, Grace curled up beside Sarah in bed, her breath warm and even. Sarah stared at the ceiling, the faint smell of cedar lingering from the bundle Heath had tucked into the rafters weeks ago. When she came down the next morning, Heath was already outside with Gideon, showing him the right way to hold a rifle. Not aiming not yet, but teaching him how to clean it, how to respect it. She waited until Gideon went in to fetch more cloth for polishing before stepping out. "You think he's ready?" Heath nodded. "Not yet, but he's listening." That's the part most boys skip. She folded her arms across her chest. "You're doing more than I asked. You didn't ask for anything." He turned to her, his voice low. "I'm not here because of obligation, Sarah. I'm here because I see a life in this place, with you in it." She didn't answer right away. The air was cold enough to make her breath visible, and she watched it fade before speaking. "I've been thinking about that land." He waited. "If we went to see it," she said slowly, "I'd want to bring the children. If they don't feel it's home, I can't either." Heath's lips parted just slightly, surprise softening his features. "Then we'll go together." She nodded, then added, "I'll need a few days to prepare. I'll make sure the wagon's ready." As she turned back toward the house, she heard him call after her, voice steady. "You're not the only one learning how to build something again." She didn't pause, but her fingers tightened around the doorframe before she stepped inside. The wagon wheels creaked slow over the rutted path, the cottonwoods thinning as the land opened into long stretches of prairie scattered with granite outcrop and sage. Sarah sat beside Heath on the bench, her gloved hands braced lightly on her lap. Gideon and Grace curled under a wool blanket in the back, whispering between themselves about the hawk they'd spotted circling above. Heath guided the team with an easy hand. "We'll come up over the rise soon. You'll see it all at once." Sarah glanced sideways. "You've been out here more than once." "3 times, he said. "Wanted to be sure the well hadn't dried and the soil still held." She nodded once, eyes fixed on the horizon. "You've been steady about it. I don't start anything I don't intend to finish." They crested the hill just as the sun broke over the eastern rim. Below, the land stretched wide and golden, a narrow creek glinting between tall grass. Cottonwoods stood in a crooked line near the bend, and a half-collapsed barn leaned against its own shadow. Grace sat up. "Are those wildflowers?" "They are," Heath said. "Late bloom, but they'll hold another week." Gideon pulled the blanket aside and leaned out to get a better look. "Is that where you'd build?" Heath pointed toward a small rise just above the creek bed. "There. Good drainage. Shelter from the north wind." Sarah stepped down once the wagon stopped, her boots sinking slightly into the soft, packed earth. She walked to the edge of the creek and crouched, dipping her fingers into the cool water. Behind her, the children picked their way through the grass, Grace collecting seed pods, Gideon eyeing the collapsed barn with interest. Heath waited until she stood again. "Thought I'd put a cabin near that sycamore. Something wide enough for 4. Sarah studied the tree, its bark pale and peeling in the light. "You've already pictured it." "I have." He didn't move closer, just watched her as she walked slowly across the field, stopping at intervals, her eyes shifting from the ridge to the water, to the open sky overhead. "I'd need a garden," she said finally, "and a smokehouse. Chickens don't do well without shelter this open. There's timber enough up near the bluff. I'd cut and haul it before the ground freezes." She turned to face him. "And if I said yes, what would you want from me in return?" He didn't hesitate. "What you've already given." The wind lifted the hem of her skirt and sent a ripple through the grass. She looked out across the land one more time, then walked back to where he stood. "I want to do it right this time," she said. "Not just for me, for them. That means a roof before snow, proper beds, a stove with more than one burner." Heath nodded. "We'll start tomorrow. I'll ride to town at first light for nails and a saw blade." "You make the list." She looked past him to where Gideon was poking at the remains of the barn, Grace arranging stones in a circle. Her voice was steadier now. "We'll marry before frost." Heath's jaw tensed just slightly, and he removed his hat, holding it against his chest. "I'll speak to Pastor Harlan this week." He paused, then added, "I want to build a life that's quiet, not small but steady. I want them to know they're safe. I want you to know it too." Sarah touched the brim of his hat with 2 fingers, then let her hand fall. "I want that too," she said. They stayed until the sun began to dip behind the ridge, the air turning sharp. Grace had fallen asleep against the wagon wheel, her collection of stones pocketed safely in her apron. Gideon sat beside her, carving a notch into a stick with his pocket knife, the kind of deep focus that didn't come from obligation but from ease. Sarah climbed back onto the wagon bench, tucking the blanket around the children as Heath checked the harness one last time. As they turned back toward home, the path behind them faded into dusk, but the land ahead opened wide, and waiting held its shape in the dark. The wedding was held in the unfinished frame of the cabin, the walls barely shoulder high, but upright and square. Heath had dragged in a plank table from town and laid it with fresh cornbread, baked salt pork, and a jar of early apples someone had gifted from their orchard. Pastor Harlan stood beneath the open rafters, coat buttoned tight against the wind. Sarah wore the same dress she'd been married in the first time, dyed a deep slate blue now, the lace at the collar mended by her own hand. She hadn't planned to wear it again, but Grace had asked, twisting a ribbon in her fingers and saying, "It already knows how to be lucky." Heath stood tall beside her, his hair combed back, the leather of his boots newly oiled. Gideon held the wedding ring, simple silver, no stone, wrapped in a scrap of cloth from Sarah's mother's sewing basket. "I won't ask you to speak vows you don't believe in," the pastor said gently. "I've said them before," Sarah answered, "but I never had the heart to keep them. I do now." Heath looked at her then, quiet and steady, and said, "I've waited a long time to put down roots. The only soil I trust is the kind you stand on." The words weren't fancy. They didn't need to be. When the pastor pronounced them husband and wife, Grace clapped once too loud, and Gideon cleared his throat like he was fighting a grin. The wind tugged gentle through the half-built walls, carrying the scent of pine and the trace of a coming storm that never arrived. That night, after the children were asleep in the wagon, Sarah sat with Heath on the unfinished porch. Her hands were wrapped around a tin cup of lukewarm tea, her shoulders draped in one of his coats. "You didn't ask me to change anything," she said. He leaned back against a post. "Didn't want to change you." She looked toward the field, where moonlight touched the edge of the creek. "I don't know what kind of wife I'll be." "You already are one," he said. "You just didn't have the name for it till now." She set the cup down and reached for his hand. His fingers were calloused, warm, familiar now in a way that felt like home. "I want to make this a place where they can grow up without fear," she said, her voice low. "We will," he answered. "Together." Winter came early that year. Snow dusted the roof beams before the last plank was nailed. But the stove arrived in time, hauled in by a neighbor with a pair of oxen and a quiet nod. Heath carved the door latch himself, and Sarah stitched curtains from old flour sacks, their printed brands still faint beneath the seams. Gideon took to the land fast, learning the weight of a spade, the rhythm of fence wire. Grace kept a list of every plant she saw bloom, pressing petals between the pages of her spelling book. The cabin filled slow but sure with warmth, with noise, with the steady thrum of something whole. One morning, as the snow melted into the first breath of spring, Sarah stood at the edge of their field, her skirt tugged by wind, her hands resting on the small of her back. Heath came up behind her, rested a palm against her waist, just above where the curve had begun to show. "It'll be different this time," she said. He nodded. It already is. She turned to him, eyes bright beneath the shadow of her bonnet. I never thought I'd find this again. Not after everything. He cupped her face, thumb brushing her cheekbone. You didn't find it. You made it. They stood there a long time, the sun rising behind them, warming the damp earth. The field would hold rows of beans, corn, maybe a few squash come summer. The cabin would get a porch swing. The barn would be raised with hands from both sides of the river. There would be hard days. There always were. But there would be laughter too at the table, in the yard, under stars that never stopped changing but always returned. In every way that mattered, they had come through the long dark. And in every way that counted, they had begun again, together.